In March 1945, more than 600 tanks crossed the Rhine River to invade Germany. They positioned themselves within sight of enemy forces, accompanied by artillery batteries and entire divisions preparing for attack. German commanders saw them through reconnaissance flights and heard them building bridges through the night. They moved thousands of troops to defend against this massive assault. But when those German soldiers finally opened fire, their artillery shells tore through the tanks like they were made of paper. Because they were, well, rubber actually, inflatable rubber that weighed 93 pounds instead of 32 tons. How is this possible? How could an entire armored division be fake? How could German intelligence, one of the most sophisticated military operations in history, fall for balloon animals disguised as weapons of war? The answer involves something the American military had never attempted before and hasn't attempted since. An entire unit dedicated not to fighting, but to lying. Not just any lies. Multimedia theatrical performances staged in active war zones with thousands of lives hanging in the balance. If the Germans had discovered the deception, every single performer would have been executed on the spot as spies. If the illusion had failed even once, real American divisions would have walked into slaughter. This is the story of 1,100 men who never fired a shot in combat, but saved an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 Allied lives. Artists recruited from Manhattan studios, sound engineers from Bell Labs, fashion designers who would become legends, painters whose work now hangs in museums, all of them sworn to absolute secrecy about an operation so classified that the US government censored every detail for 50 years after the war ended. No veterans could speak, no records could be published. The greatest con in military history had to remain completely invisible. By 1944, the Allies were desperate. D-Day had succeeded, but Germany wasn't collapsing. It was fighting harder than ever. Every mile toward Berlin cost hundreds of American lives. Military planners faced an impossible equation. How do you convince an enemy that your army is larger, stronger, and in different places than reality? How do you make 1,000 men look like 30,000? Traditional camouflage could hide things, but this required the opposite. They needed to create entire divisions out of nothing. They needed magic on an industrial scale. And they needed it to work perfectly because failure meant not just military defeat, but the execution of everyone involved for espionage. But nobody expected what would happen on January 20th, 1944, when the US Army activated a unit with no official name, no combat weapons, and a mission that sounded like it came from a Hollywood pitch meeting rather than the Pentagon. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops gathered for the first time at Camp Forest, Tennessee in early 1944. Their commanding officer received orders that must have seemed insane. Take 1,100 men, most with zero combat experience, and teach them to impersonate entire armored divisions. Make the enemy believe phantom armies are massing for attack while real troops slip past undetected. Do this repeatedly across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany, often within 3 miles of German lines, where enemy scouts could stumble onto your sets at any moment. The unit needed men who could think like stage managers, not soldiers. So military recruiters did something unprecedented. They raided art schools. They walked into Pratt Institute, Cooper Union, and the Philadelphia Museum School of Art looking for painters, sculptors, and designers. The recruitment pitch was bizarre. Join the army, see Europe, and use your creativity to trick Nazis. Most had no idea what they were signing up for. One recruit thought he'd be painting camouflage on trucks. Instead, he'd be building fake armies. Among the recruits was a young fashion designer named Bill Blass, who would later dress first ladies. Ellsworth Kelly, who would become one of America's most celebrated abstract painters. Wildlife artist Arthur Singer. Photographer Art Kane. These weren't military minds, they were creative minds. That was precisely the point. The army had calculated that art students averaged IQs around 119, one of the highest of any military unit ever assembled. Intelligence mattered because every operation required improvisation under pressure. Here's what made this insane. The army gave them almost no resources compared to real divisions. A typical armored division had 15,000 men and hundreds of actual tanks, each weighing 32 tons. The Ghost Army would simulate that exact force with 100 men and inflatable dummies weighing 93 pounds. Real artillery battalions had dozens of functioning howitzers. The Ghost Army carried rubber tubes shaped like guns that couldn't fire a single shell. A legitimate infantry division required thousands of vehicles. The Ghost Army drove the same 6 trucks in circles to create the illusion of endless convoys. The equipment was revolutionary and ridiculous in equal measure. Engineers at U.S. Rubber Company in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, designed inflatable M4 Sherman tanks built on a skeleton of inflatable tubes covered with rubberized neoprene. When deflated, a tank fit into a canvas bag that 2 men could carry. When inflated, which took 20 minutes with a portable air compressor, it became 18 feet, 4 inches long, 8 feet, 3 inches wide, and 7 feet, 9 inches tall. From 300 yards away, it looked identical to the real thing. From aerial reconnaissance at 5,000 feet, it was indistinguishable. But here's the insane part. Making fake tanks look real required as much work as maintaining actual tanks. After inflation, artists hand-painted weathering effects, rust patterns, and unit insignia. Nothing could look factory fresh because real tanks accumulated dirt, scratches, and wear. One artistic mistake, maybe a shadow painted on the wrong side, would reveal the deception to aerial photographers. Then there were the tracks. Real tanks left distinctive tread marks, weighing tons, pressing into soil. Inflatable tanks left nothing. So engineers drove bulldozers in careful patterns around dummy positions, creating track marks that matched exactly how real armor would deploy. The manufacturing process was equally absurd. In Woonsocket, a 16-year-old high school student named Teresa Ricard worked after-school shifts cementing rubber tubes for 49 cents per hour. She and her co-workers called them targets, because nobody told them what these strange inflatable objects were actually for. The Scranton Lace Curtain Manufacturing Company in Pennsylvania, a factory that normally made decorative curtains, suddenly found itself producing fake artillery pieces. Goodyear Tire Company built inflatable Jeeps. The entire American rubber industry quietly shifted to manufacturing military theater props while maintaining absolute secrecy. Production numbers were staggering. By D-Day, the Ghost Army had hundreds of inflatable tanks, dozens of fake artillery pieces, inflatable jeeps, inflatable transport trucks, and even inflatable liaison aircraft. The visual deception arsenal could simulate 2 complete armored divisions, roughly 30,000 men and all associated equipment, and it all fit into several transport trucks. What nobody knew at the time was that British forces had already pioneered these techniques in North Africa at the Battle of El Alamein in 1942. British deception units created entire fake airfields, complete with dummy Spitfires and fuel depots, drawing German bombers to waste munitions on plywood and canvas. The British called it Operation Bertram, and it worked so well that German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel later admitted the deceptions had completely fooled him about Allied strength and positioning. American military planners studying the British success realized they needed their own deception capability, but mobile and more sophisticated. The British approach required weeks of preparation for a single location. The Americans wanted a traveling roadshow that could set up, perform, and move to the next venue within days. That's when 2 unlikely men created the concept that became the Ghost Army. Major Ralph Ingersoll was a celebrity journalist who had been managing editor of The New Yorker, publisher of Fortune magazine, and founder of the New York newspaper PM. The New York Times once described him as a prodigiously energetic egotist. He had zero military background, but had written a best-selling book about combat in North Africa that caught Army attention. Ingersoll partnered with Colonel Billy Harris, a career officer who understood how military deception could save lives by drawing enemy forces away from real attack points. Together, they pitched an idea that sounded insane: create a unit whose only weapons would be imagination, rubber, radios, and sound effects. Ingersoll later called the 23rd his con artists and claimed its creation was his sole original contribution to the entire war. He was probably right. Nothing like it had ever existed, and nothing like it has existed since. The Ghost Army would be the first mobile, multimedia tactical deception unit in US military history. Training began in early 1944 at Pine Camp, New York. Men who had been painting portraits months earlier now learned to inflate dummy tanks under fire. Sound engineers from Bell Labs taught recruits how to operate speakers that could project recorded noise 15 miles. Radio operators studied how to mimic the transmission patterns of real units so precisely that German listeners couldn't detect the forgery. Security personnel practiced setting up perimeters that kept civilians and potential spies away from the fake installations without drawing attention. The pressure was extraordinary because everyone understood the stakes. If Germans captured Ghost Army soldiers and discovered inflatable tanks, they'd be shot as spies under international law. These men weren't carrying weapons of war, they were carrying props. There would be no protection as prisoners of war. Execution would be certain and immediate. Every single performance required perfection, not just for mission success, but for survival. By May 1944, the Ghost Army was ready, or as ready as anyone could be for a mission this absurd. They shipped to England, equipment carefully disguised in standard military crates. Nobody outside the unit knew what they carried. Even most Allied commanders had no idea the 23rd existed. Secrecy was total and absolute. 2 weeks after D-Day, advance teams arrived in Normandy while bodies still littered the beaches. Their first mission sounded simple: simulate a Mulberry Harbor, one of the massive artificial ports the Allies built to unload supplies, at night using lights intended to draw German artillery fire away from the real installation. Simple, except they'd be operating within range of German guns, deliberately trying to attract enemy fire toward their position. Welcome to France. Then came Operation Brittany in late June 1944, their first full-scale performance. The actual mission: American forces were besieging the German-held port of Brest with a force much smaller than required for a proper siege. The Germans outnumbered the attackers and should have broken out easily. The Ghost Army's job: make the Germans believe they were surrounded by overwhelming forces. Make a few thousand look like tens of thousands. The performance needed to be so convincing that German commanders would choose to stay trapped rather than risk attacking phantom divisions. Here's how they did it. Under cover of darkness, Ghost Army trucks moved into positions around Brest. At dawn, German reconnaissance flights saw a massive American force where none had existed hours before. Hundreds of tanks, artillery batteries, supply depots, motor pools. Radio operators transmitted false communications mimicking the patterns of multiple divisions. German radio intelligence intercepted messages suggesting 3 American divisions were preparing coordinated attacks. Sound trucks played pre-recorded noises of large-scale troop movements, construction projects, and tank formations through speakers powerful enough to carry 15 miles. Meanwhile, actual Ghost Army soldiers drove through nearby towns wearing shoulder patches from different American divisions, casually mentioning in bars and cafes, where enemy agents might overhear, that massive reinforcements had arrived. They staged fake briefings with officers dressed as generals, complete with motorcades and military police escorts. Everything designed for enemy scouts watching from a distance, or local French civilians who might pass information to German intelligence. The Germans bought it completely. They never attempted a breakout from Brest. The siege continued, and when the port finally fell, captured German officers expressed shock that American forces had been so much smaller than intelligence had indicated. The Ghost Army's first performance had worked, but success created new problems. Word spread through Allied command that this bizarre unit with inflatable tanks actually delivered results. Suddenly, everyone wanted the Ghost Army. Real combat commanders realized that a few hundred artists with rubber props could accomplish what thousands of infantry couldn't: make the enemy commit forces to defend against attacks that would never come. Between June 1944 and May 1945, the 23rd staged between 20 and 25 major deception operations across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. Each operation required the unit to impersonate a different real division with perfect accuracy. Like a repertory theater company, they'd spend 1 week pretending to be the 75th Infantry Division, then the next week becoming the 6th Armored Division, complete with different insignia, different radio protocols, different everything. The Sonic Deception Arm, the 3133rd Signal Service Company, developed techniques that bordered on science fiction for 1944. Engineers had recorded sounds of actual military units onto phonograph records. Sherman tanks moving over mud versus gravel versus pavement, jeep convoys at different speeds, bridge construction projects, artillery emplacements being dug. They had 30-minute sound loops for every conceivable military activity. These recordings were made on cutting-edge equipment and played back through speakers originally designed for drive-in theaters, modified to project audio 15 miles with remarkable clarity. Wind speed and direction affected how sound traveled, so the unit created a mobile weather station. Before each sonic operation, meteorologists calculated exactly where to position speakers, so German listeners in specific locations would hear precisely calibrated noises. Too loud sounded fake. Too quiet was useless. The balance required mathematical precision and artistic judgment working together. One sonic operator recalled playing bridge building sounds continuously for 3 nights near Metz, France. Germans across the river could hear clearly and unmistakably American combat engineers assembling pontoon bridges. They could hear trucks arriving with construction materials. They could hear officers shouting orders. They could hear every detail of a major river crossing being prepared. Except none of it was real. The trucks were recordings, the bridges were sound effects. The entire construction project existed only as audio theater designed to convince Germans that an attack was imminent in that location when the real crossing would happen 20 miles away. Radio deception, handled by operators called spoof radio specialists, required even more sophistication. German signals intelligence had been intercepting Allied radio traffic since 1939. They'd studied American communication patterns for years. They knew how different units transmitted, which frequencies they preferred, what kind of message traffic to expect from a division headquarters versus an artillery battalion. Ghost Army radio operators had to master not just the content of fake messages, but the style. Every real radio operator had distinctive habits in how they sent Morse code, almost like handwriting. Ghost Army specialists studied real operators and mimicked their transmission patterns so precisely that German listeners believed they were hearing the authentic unit. During one operation in Luxembourg, Ghost Army operators impersonated the 75th Infantry Division, while the real 75th moved 50 miles away for a surprise attack. For 6 days, Germans intercepted radio traffic from what they believed was the 75th Division holding defensive positions. The traffic patterns matched perfectly: routine status reports, supply requisitions, patrol coordination, everything a static infantry division would transmit. Germans had no idea the real 75th was massing for an offensive until tanks started rolling into their positions from an unexpected direction. But radio and sound meant nothing if the visuals failed. That's where the 603rd Camouflage engineers worked their magic. These artists, many recruited directly from art schools, became masters of military theater set design. They could transform an empty field into a bustling tank formation in 4 hours. Positioning was critical. Inflatable tanks arranged randomly looked wrong to anyone who understood armor tactics. They had to be positioned exactly as real tank companies would deploy. Correct spacing for avoiding artillery bracketing, proper intervals for maneuverability, command tanks positioned where officers would actually place them. Details mattered obsessively. Real military encampments had laundry hanging on clotheslines, so Ghost Army soldiers strung up actual laundry between dummy positions. Real motor pools had oil stains and scattered equipment, so artists aged and weathered every dummy vehicle. Real artillery batteries had ammunition storage and fire control positions, so those elements were meticulously recreated. Nothing could be perfect, because real military equipment never looked perfect. One artist remembered spending 2 hours carefully adding rust streaks to an inflatable tank, his paint job, because aerial photographs would show that detail and perfect paint would reveal the tank as fake. Another recalled positioning empty artillery shell casings around dummy guns, because real batteries always had scattered brass. Every single element of the illusion had to withstand scrutiny from enemy reconnaissance flights and ground observation. The cardinal rule governed everything. Never carry inflatables across roads or open areas during daylight. 2 men carrying a 40-ton tank would instantly destroy months of deception. One corporal remembered halting 2 French civilians on bicycles who accidentally approached a Ghost Army position. They'd already seen 4 soldiers lifting and rotating an inflatable Sherman tank, physically impossible with real armor. Searching for an explanation, the corporal finally told them the Americans are very strong and sent them away. Whether they spread that story to German agents or simply thought Americans had superhuman strength remains unknown. Darkness became the Ghost Army's primary cover. Most deployments happened at night. Trucks arrived after sunset carrying deflated equipment. By dawn, German reconnaissance would photograph a fully operational armored division that hadn't existed 8 hours earlier. Then came the crucial test. Did Germans respond? Did their units reposition to counter the perceived threat? Did their radio intercepts show increased command attention to that sector? If so, the Ghost Army had succeeded. If not, they'd failed, and real troops might die because the deception didn't draw enemy forces away from actual attack points. Operation Bettembourg in September 1944, near the French-German border, tested every capability simultaneously. Real American forces planned to attack German positions near Metz. The Ghost Army staged a massive deception 20 miles north, simulating the 43rd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron preparing for a major offensive. Inflatable tanks, fake artillery, sonic deceptions playing sounds of armor massing, radio traffic indicating imminent attack, and the theatrical touch. Ghost Army soldiers dressed in 43rd Cavalry insignia visiting nearby towns, casually mentioning to anyone listening that their unit had just arrived and would be attacking soon. German forces repositioned. Artillery batteries relocated to defend against the fake cavalry threat. Infantry reinforcements moved north. Meanwhile, the real American attack 20 miles south met significantly lighter resistance than expected. The Ghost Army had successfully pulled German defenders out of position, lives saved through theater. But then, something happened that demonstrated the razor's edge these men walked. During Bettembourg, German artillery began shelling the Ghost Army positions based on reconnaissance reports. Real shells started landing among fake tanks. The 406th Combat Engineers, the security unit protecting the artists and radio operators, had to hunker in foxholes while high explosives tore apart rubber dummies all around them. One shell scored a direct hit on an inflatable Sherman, shredding it completely. Another destroyed a fake artillery piece. Under normal circumstances, losing equipment to enemy fire confirms the position is valuable. But if Germans actually overran the position and discovered shredded rubber instead of destroyed metal, the entire program would be exposed and lives throughout the European theater would be endangered. Ghost Army soldiers scrambled between artillery barrages to patch the damaged inflatables, re-inflate them, and make them look operational again before German forward observers could assess damage too closely. It worked. Germans continued believing they damaged but not destroyed an American armored position. They never investigated close enough to discover the truth. The winter of 1944-45 brought the Ghost Army's most challenging period. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes, caught Allied forces completely off guard. Suddenly, American units were retreating, German forces were advancing, and the carefully planned deceptions became desperate improvisations. The Ghost Army deployed multiple times during this period, staging defensive positions where no real troops existed, trying to slow German reconnaissance from discovering how thin American lines actually were in certain sectors. One operation during the Bulge required the Ghost Army to simulate two entire divisions, the 30th Infantry and the 79th Infantry, holding defensive positions while the real divisions withdrew for rest and refitting after brutal combat. For nearly a week, 1,500 artists and sound engineers pretended to be 30,000 exhausted combat veterans digging in to hold territory. German forces probed those positions but never attacked in force because intelligence suggested strong American defenses. In reality, those positions had no real defenses at all, just rubber tanks, sound effects, and radio chatter. The danger was extraordinary. Unlike earlier operations in relatively stable sectors, the Bulge meant fluid battle lines with German forces potentially breaking through at any moment. Ghost Army positions were often within 2 miles of German lines, sometimes closer. Their heaviest weapons were 50 caliber machine guns, useless against tanks or organized infantry assaults. If Germans had attacked in force, the Ghost Army would have been slaughtered immediately. Their only protection was the illusion working so perfectly that Germans believed attacking would be suicidal. Throughout this period, Ghost Army soldiers lived in constant tension between two fears: that their deception would fail and Germans would attack, or that it would succeed too well and draw overwhelming German forces to their position. Both outcomes meant death. The only survival path was the Goldilocks middle, convincing enough to make Germans cautious, but not so convincing they committed major forces to eliminate the perceived threat. As winter turned to spring in 1945, Allied forces prepared for the final push into Germany itself. The last major obstacle was the Rhine River, the natural defensive barrier protecting Germany's industrial heartland. Crossing the Rhine required massive coordination, and military planners knew German forces would defend it fanatically. Every crossing would be contested, every bridge would be a slaughter, unless the Ghost Army could pull off their most ambitious performance yet. Operation Viersen in March 1945 became the Ghost Army's masterpiece and final performance. The US 9th Army planned to cross the Rhine with 2 divisions, the 30th Infantry and 79th Infantry, attacking from the 15th Corps sector. Military planners wanted Germans to expect the crossing elsewhere, ideally drawing forces away from the actual crossing point. The mission given to the Ghost Army: make Germans believe those 2 divisions, roughly 40,000 men, are preparing to cross the Rhine 20 miles north in the Thran Corps sector at Viersen. This would be an all-hands operation, requiring every deception technique perfected over the previous 10 months. The scale was unprecedented. The Ghost Army would simulate not just 2 divisions, but the entire infrastructure needed for a major river crossing. Supply depots, artillery parks, engineer equipment, bridging materials, the works. More than 600 inflatable vehicles, including tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and even liaison aircraft. Dozens of sound trucks operating around the clock. Radio operators mimicking 2 complete division headquarters plus supporting units. And the theatrical elements, officers dressed as generals inspecting positions, military police with division insignia manning checkpoints, soldiers spreading rumors in towns about the impending assault. The operation began March 18, 1945. Under darkness, Ghost Army convoys moved into positions around Viersen on the Rhine's western bank. By dawn, March 19th, German reconnaissance flights photographed massive American forces concentrating near Viersen. The aerial photographs looked perfect. Proper spacing, realistic camouflage, exactly what 2 divisions preparing for assault would look like. That night, sonic units began playing sounds of bridge construction. Germans across the Rhine could hear unmistakable noises of pontoon bridges being assembled, pile drivers, construction equipment, officers shouting orders. The sounds continued night after night. Meanwhile, actual bridging units attached to the Ghost Army assembled real bridge sections in plain view near Viersen. Just not enough to actually span the Rhine, but enough to look like preparations were underway. Engineers set off flash canisters to simulate artillery fire from the fake positions. Everything designed to convince Germans that the main assault would come at Viersen. Radio operators created traffic patterns indicating 2 division headquarters establishing command posts near Viersen. They transmitted requisitions for bridging materials, medical supplies, ammunition, everything real divisions would need. German signals intelligence intercepted hundreds of messages over 6 days, all pointing to imminent attack at Viersen. And it worked. German forces repositioned. A captured German order of battle map found after the war showed they'd placed the 79th Division exactly where the Ghost Army simulated it and had completely lost track of the 30th Division's actual location. German defensive preparations focused on Viersen, with artillery batteries and infantry reinforcements moving north to defend against the expected assault. On March 23rd, the real attack came 20 miles south in the 17th Corps sector. The 30th and 79th Divisions crossed the Rhine facing disorganized resistance and catastrophically light casualties. Intelligence officers reported the attack came as complete surprise to the enemy, with a consequent saving of American lives. German prisoners of war, including battalion and regimental officers, said no one expected an attack from the west. All had been told to expect assault from the north across the Lippe River, exactly where the Ghost Army had staged their deception. Initial casualty reports for the 2 divisions crossing the Rhine reported approximately 30 casualties total for the initial assault, an astonishingly low number for what should have been one of the war's bloodiest river crossings. Colonel Harry Reeder, commanding officer of the Ghost Army, later said that this operation alone justified the unit's entire existence. 30 casualties instead of thousands. Hundreds of lives saved because Germans were looking in the wrong direction when American forces crossed. But here's what makes this even more remarkable. While Germans were shelling the Ghost Army's rubber tanks at Viersen, real American forces were building actual bridges and crossing the Rhine almost unopposed elsewhere. German artillery wasted thousands of shells, destroying inflatable equipment while real armor drove into Germany. The deception didn't just work. It worked so perfectly that Germans damaged decoys, while real forces achieved their objectives virtually untouched. The war in Europe ended May 8, 1945. The Ghost Army's final tally, between 20 and 25 major deception operations, estimated 15,000 to 30,000 Allied lives saved, and 0 combat casualties despite operating within miles of enemy lines for 11 months. Not a single Ghost Army soldier was killed by direct enemy action during deception operations, an extraordinary record given how close they operated to German forces and how catastrophic discovery would have been. But then, something unexpected happened. Immediately after VE Day, every Ghost Army soldier received orders that would govern the rest of their lives. You will never speak about what you did. The entire operation was classified at the highest levels. Equipment was collected and either destroyed or recycled into aggressor force training programs where US Army units practiced fighting against simulated enemies. Records were sealed. Photographs were locked in classified archives. The inflatable tanks were destroyed. As far as anyone knows, not a single complete inflatable Sherman tank survived. Veterans couldn't tell their families. They couldn't tell friends. When asked what they did in the war, Ghost Army members had to give vague answers about camouflage work or special engineering. Many struggled with this burden because they'd participated in something extraordinary, something that saved thousands of lives, and couldn't share that pride with anyone. Imagine being an artist who helped win World War II through creativity, and you're legally prohibited from ever claiming credit. The reasoning behind total secrecy made sense from a military perspective. If enemies discovered deception techniques used in World War II, those techniques couldn't be used in future conflicts. The US military wanted to preserve the capability to stage similar operations in Korea, Vietnam, or elsewhere. Tactical deception remains valuable only if adversaries don't know your methods. So the Ghost Army disappeared from official history. One exception occurred in 1945, immediately after the war, when a single newspaper article mentioned the unit's existence, but provided almost no details. Then, nothing for 40 years. In 1985, a Smithsonian Magazine article by former Ghost Army member Arthur Shilstone finally broke the silence. Shilstone's account described inflatable tanks, sonic deceptions, and theatrical performances on battlefields. The article attracted attention, but most Americans found the story too bizarre to believe. Inflatable tanks, sound effects, artists fighting with imagination. It sounded like fiction, and since records remained classified, there was minimal documentation to prove Shilstone's claims. The US government acknowledged the article, but immediately reclassified many records that had been referenced. It wasn't until the mid-1990s, 50 years after World War II ended, that full declassification occurred. Suddenly, thousands of photographs, operation reports, and first-hand accounts became available. Historians discovered that the Ghost Army had been real, had been effective, and had operated far more extensively than anyone outside military intelligence had imagined. What emerged from declassified files revealed fascinating details. The average age of Ghost Army soldiers was 24. Many were Jewish refugees from Europe who'd fled Nazi persecution, then enlisted to fight Hitler with art instead of guns. Several members were gay men who would have been dishonorably discharged if discovered, yet they served with distinction, knowing exposure meant not just military consequences, but potential imprisonment. The unit's diversity, ethnic, religious, sexual, was extraordinary for 1940s American military, though it had to remain invisible due to the era's prejudices. Many Ghost Army veterans went on to remarkable careers. Bill Blass became one of America's most famous fashion designers, dressing Jackie Kennedy and Nancy Reagan. Ellsworth Kelly's abstract paintings now sell for millions and hang in major museums worldwide. Art Kane photographed the most iconic jazz portrait ever taken, the 1958 Great Day in Harlem image, featuring 57 jazz legends. Arthur Singer illustrated hundreds of field guides to birds. Dozens more became successful commercial artists, designers, photographers, and architects. Interestingly, many veterans later said their Ghost Army experience fundamentally shaped their artistic careers. They'd learned to work under impossible pressure, to improvise creative solutions with limited resources, and to understand that art could have real-world consequences beyond aesthetics. Designing a fake tank that convinces enemy aerial reconnaissance required the same skills as designing effective advertising. understanding the audience, creating believable narratives, and paying obsessive attention to details that make illusions work. The sonic deception techniques developed by the Ghost Army influenced post-war audio engineering. Engineers who'd created mobile sound systems capable of projecting audio 15 miles later applied those innovations to early public address systems, drive-in theaters, and eventually concert sound systems. The Ghost Army's technical solutions to battlefield audio challenges became the foundation for modern large-scale sound reinforcement. The inflatable tank technology had even stranger afterlives. US Rubber's lead designer Fred Patton had also designed inflatable one-man life rafts carried by fighter pilots in the Pacific. After the war, he applied lessons learned from making 93-pound tanks look like 32-ton weapons to developing better survival equipment. Modern inflatable boats and emergency equipment use engineering principles developed while creating battlefield deceptions. Radio deception techniques pioneered by Ghost Army operators influenced Cold War signals intelligence. The capability to mimic another unit's communication patterns while fooling sophisticated enemy listeners became critical during Korea and Vietnam. Electronic warfare specialists studied Ghost Army methods for decades, applying 1940s ingenuity to increasingly complex electronic battlefields. But perhaps the most significant legacy was psychological. The Ghost Army proved that military deception could work at scale in modern warfare. It demonstrated that relatively small units could have strategic impact far beyond their size by manipulating enemy perceptions. Every major military now maintains deception capabilities, units that specialize in making adversaries see threats that don't exist while real forces operate elsewhere. The Ghost Army wrote the playbook. Modern military deception operations remain classified, but occasional glimpses suggest the fundamentals haven't changed much. During the 1991 Gulf War, coalition forces staged elaborate fake buildups in certain sectors while massing real forces elsewhere for the main assault into Iraq. During the 2003 invasion of Iraq, Special Operations Forces conducted deception operations to confuse Iraqi forces about where attacks would come. The techniques evolved with technology, now involving electronic warfare, cyber operations, and drone decoys. But the core concept remains identical to what 100 artists did with rubber tanks in 1944, make the enemy commit forces to defend against threats that don't exist. What makes the Ghost Army even more remarkable in historical context is what they prevented. Military historians estimate that without deception, operations like Viersen, major river crossings into Germany, would have cost 10,000 to 20,000 additional Allied casualties. The Battle of the Bulge could have collapsed American lines if Germans had discovered how thinly stretched certain sectors actually were. D-Day's success depended partly on deceptions that convinced Germans the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. And while the Ghost Army didn't directly participate in D-Day deceptions, their later operations used techniques perfected by the same British units that had fooled Hitler about invasion locations. The Cold War would have been even more dangerous if the Soviet Union had captured Ghost Army veterans and forced them to reveal tactical deception capabilities. That's why secrecy lasted 50 years, preventing potential adversaries from understanding exactly how deception operations functioned at technical and operational levels. In 2022, President Joe Biden signed the Ghost Army Congressional Gold Medal Act, authorizing Congress's highest civilian honor for the unit. On March 21, 2024, 3 surviving Ghost Army members, ages 98 to 100, attended a ceremony at the U.S. Capitol where Speaker Mike Johnson presented the medal. Only 7 known Ghost Army members were still alive at that point. Most had waited more than 7 decades for official recognition of what they'd accomplished. One veteran, Bernard Bluestein, aged 98 when interviewed in 2023, recalled that he was 19 years old when he enlisted after seeing a vaguely worded notice at his Cleveland Art College seeking recruits for a special unit. He'd wanted to serve but wasn't the fighter-type person. He had no idea the assignment would require operating within range of German artillery. "If I had known that before I got into the service," he said, "I probably would have made a different decision." But he also reflected that the experience taught him more about creativity under pressure than any art class ever could. The Ghost Army's story raises fascinating questions about creativity in warfare. For thousands of years, military success meant superior tactics, better weapons, more soldiers. Suddenly, in World War II, it meant superior imagination. Artists became force multipliers, paintings became weapons, theater saved lives. That transformation reflected broader changes in warfare. Victory increasingly depended on information, perception and psychology, rather than purely physical force. That evolution continues today. Modern militaries invest billions in cyber warfare, information operations, and perception management. The goal remains identical to what the Ghost Army pioneered: make adversaries believe things that aren't true, causing them to make wrong decisions that create tactical advantages. Rubber tanks became computer malware, sound trucks became social media psyops,